Welcome back to Vintage Camera Digest. A few weeks ago, I did an episode on the basics of metering. Today, we're going to take it a step further and dig into some more advanced methods and techniques, so stay tuned. The fundamental problem for any photograph you intend to make is determining exposure, providing the sensor or film with a sufficient enough light to capture the subject as you envision it. It all really does come down to that. Whatever shutter speed you choose for controlling subject motion, or whatever f-stop you want for controlling depth of field, are both going to come secondary to the exposure, because without proper exposure, those two things are going to lose whatever potential impact you're trying to make with them. A few weeks ago, we discussed how light meters work in general, and how they are calibrated for a middle gray. If you haven't seen that episode yet, I really recommend that you stop here and go watch that first, because this will make a lot more sense if you have that basic understanding. But once you've got a good grasp on the basics of the concept, you'll be ready to dive in a little bit deeper. That video talks about how meters work and how you can use your camera's built-in meter to arrive at a correct exposure. This video, however, is mostly going to be about how we can determine exposure apart from the camera's meter using external methods, and we're going to start simple and work our way up from there. I'm also going to divide these methods into two main categories: objective and subjective measurement. Objective methods are ones where we'll measure the light directly without regard to the subject. Subjective methods, on the other hand, are ones where we're not as concerned with the direct light as much as we are with the subject and its inherent reflected values. I'm not sure those words are the best way to articulate that idea, but I think it'll become more clear as we get into it a little further. So in my photography classes, when we get to the part about setting correct exposures, a lot of times my students are surprised that they might get a different reading in one corner of the classroom than another. And I think they're a little disappointed that lighting can be so varied, even if it isn't by much. I think a lot of times we'd rather have quick, absolute answers that we can memorize instead of working through a process or a solution. And honestly, that applies to a lot more than photography. But wouldn't it be nice to have a lighting situation that we could memorize that could establish a base exposure that we could work from? Well, we have one, and it's called the Sunny 16 rule. And under certain conditions, it's a very dependable place to start when determining exposure. The rule goes like this: when your subject is illuminated by the direct suns, no clouds and not backlit, you can set your shutter speed to match your ISO, or film speed, and then choose f16 as your aperture. And that combination will provide a correct exposure. For example, if we're using 100 as our ISO or have a roll of 100 speed film, we can set our shutter speed as close to 1/100th of a second as we can. In old cameras, that might mean choosing a shutter speed of 1/125th of a second. Newer cameras, though, might let us choose exactly 1/100th of a second. But once that's done, just set your f-stop to f16, and that's going to provide you a fairly accurate base exposure. And once you know the base exposure, you can extrapolate others from it, because f16 is going to provide a rather deep depth of field. But what if you want a more shallow depth of field, maybe like f4? Well, this is going to be when understanding the relationship between shutter speed and f-stop is necessary. But if we're comfortable with that, we can figure the whole thing out in our heads. But it probably wouldn't be a terrible idea to do a video on that. So note to self: work on exposure equation video. Anyway, f4 is 4 stops more light than f16. And if we just change the aperture and leave the shutter speed where it is, we're going to have a photo that's overexposed by 4 stops. So in order to keep the overall exposure balanced, we'll need to decrease the shutter speed by 4 stops. So if we started with a shutter speed of 1/125th of a second, we'll need to change that to 1/2000th of a second to maintain a proper exposure. That's a pretty fast shutter speed, and a lot of old film cameras won't have that as an option. And a quick side note here: this is a great illustration of why it's always important to choose an ISO or film speed to match your lighting situation. If we were using an ISO of 800 in this same situation, our beginning shutter speed might be at 1/1000th of a second. And if we change the aperture from f16 to f4, we need to change the shutter speed to 1/16,000th of a second to keep the exposure balanced, which is a faster shutter speed than has ever existed on a regular camera. Most modern cameras top out at 1/4000th of a second, and advanced and pro level cameras might have 1/8,000th of a second. The only cameras I know of that have ever featured faster speeds were made by Minolta, the 9XI and the Alpha 9, that had 1/12,000th as its top speeds. And those are both film cameras from the late 1900s. Next up, we have another method that I mentioned in the first metering video, using a gray card. A gray card is designed to be the exact color of gray that the camera meters are calibrated to, and they're pretty simple to use. All you have to do is position it in the same light that's falling on your subject, move in close enough until the card fills the frame, and use your camera meter to set the exposure correctly. Now, let's go compare these two methods. So the first thing we're going to shoot is the Sunny 16 rule. Now the entire part of the church that we're seeing here isn't directly illuminated by the sun, only the front is, but that's going to make it a little bit more interesting, I think. But I've got 100 speed film, I've got my shutter speed set to 1/125th of a second, and the aperture set to f/16. So according to the Sunny 16 rule, that is correct. So we're going to shoot one like that first, and then we'll shoot another one in a different way. I'm going to shoot low so that I can get just a little bit more interest in this. The sky is not very interesting today, but that's all right. So next up, we're going to meter off of the gray card. So this is another way of measuring the direct light, because this is the actual gray that meters are calibrated for. Now, my Bronica doesn't have a built-in meter, so I can't use it to do the metering, but I'm going to use my spot meter to do that. All right, ISO is set to 100. My shutter speed is still set to 1/125th of a second. So I just need to make sure that the card is in the same light, and it's telling me f11.5. If I shoot directly this way, it's a little bit less, it's at f11. And here we have 11.3 or 11.5, depending on exactly where it is. So using the gray card in this direction is actually one stop less than Sunny 16. So let's shoot it at f11. Same shot, just changing the f-stop to f11 instead of f16. Oh, we have a couple of clouds in the back, make this nice and interesting, hopefully. Those results are sort of what I was expecting. My experience with the Sunny 16 rule is that it always seems to underexpose the subject just a bit. But since I'm aware of that, it's easy enough to bracket exposure some to make sure I get the best exposure. I purposely did not bracket any of the shots in this episode so that we could get an authentic feel for the different methods. In a real shooting situation, I'm going to utilize the exposure tools I have at my disposal, but I still may adjust exposure a little here and there. Also, I only did really simple processing on these negatives. I used Photoshop curves to set the black point on the clear film base, and I warmed up the shots just a bit with a bit of toning. Next up is incident metering. Most metering methods rely on reflected metering, measuring the light that reflects from the subject. But in the first metering video, we saw how the subject could skew the results based on that reflectivity. If you recall, the white card and the black card were sitting right beside each other in the exact same amount of light. However, when using a reflected light meter, we got dramatically different results when we metered off of each one. The white card reflected more light, and the meter interpreted that as actually being more light. The black card reflected less light, and the meter interpreted that as being less light. But in reality, the two cards were lit by the same amount of light. So if there was a way to measure the light that falls on the subject instead of that which is reflected by it, it could theoretically be more accurate. And lucky for us, that's what incident meters do. They measure light directly without regard for the subject's reflectivity. And again, under certain conditions, this can be a very accurate way of metering. One of those conditions will be the ability to place the meter in the same exact light as your subject, and another, maybe less obvious condition will be that the subject should be rather evenly lit. Now we'll get into that in a little bit to understand why that's important. But if the subject is close by and easy to access, we can just walk right up to it, Point the meter back toward camera position. This way the meter is seeing the same angle of light that the camera is shooting from. We don't want to point the meter over to the side because that's not the same light that the camera's seeing. We want to take the measurement on the camera side. We just need to make sure we set the ISO to the film speed or the ISO that we're using. Then depending on the meter, you enter a shutter speed or f-stop and press the measure button. Easy as pie. So I have 1/60th of a second at f4 right here. It's also possible to use an incident meter in situations where you actually can't physically get to your subject's position. Just make sure that you take the reading in the same light as your subject and you'll generally be good to go. And once you get the hang of it, that's probably the way you'll end up using the incident meter most of the time.
So behind me we have a really contrasty lighting situation. We've got the light colored roofing on this covered bridge, which is really reflective. And then we also have the light colored gravel down at the front, which is really reflective. Almost the same reflectivity as the roof, I would say. And then we have the structure itself, the bridge, dark planks. And then inside though, there's detail, but it's in shadow. So I think this is a really tough scene to get right. I'm not sure it's even possible to do, but we're gonna see. First thing I'm gonna do, I'm gonna take an incident reading of it. Gonna take the light meter down to the subject, or at least in this pool of light that's gonna be illuminating from this side. Take a reading, we'll take a shot at that, and then we'll meter it in a couple of other ways just to see if that's better. This is one of the situations where I think an incident light meter is probably not as good as a spot meter because we've got a tremendous amount of contrast. So, but anyway, let's check and see. I have got 100 speed film, got my shutter speed set to 1/250th of a second. Let's go see what the f-stop is. Of course, I want to point the meter back toward camera position because that's where I'm shooting from. It's telling me 1/250th of a second at f8. All right, 1/250th of a second at f8.
Yeah, that scene is a nightmare for incident metering. So let's find a better one.
Right here we have something that's more evenly lit. This is going to be much better for this type of thing because we don't have some really bright areas and some really dark areas like we did earlier. So let's use incident light metering on this. So I'm going to shoot camera up here. I've got the 24mm on, so it's super wide. So the only really bright spot I've got is in the background, and I don't think that's enough to even matter. So I have got, let's see, I'm gonna try 1/250th of a second and see what that gives me. 2.8, 1/250th of a second at 2.8. Let's go 1/25th of a second at f4. So I don't have to shoot wide open.
That was much better. I have to say that the first shot is about the worst result I've ever had using an incident meter, and it happened in front of the entire internet. Anyway, moving on. Now, I've said it before and I'll say it again. It's great when companies bring out new products that support classic cameras. One of the best ideas of late is the clip-on style light meter. These are meters that read reflected light that you can usually mount on the accessory shoe of your camera, assuming your camera has one. If you don't have an accessory shoe, you can still use it, you just hold it to measure. The benefit of being shoe mounted though is that it's usually close to the lens, and that means that it's more or less measuring what the lens is pointing to. You just need to make sure that you have the camera aimed in the right direction when pressing the button to take the measurement. Don't point it toward the ground or hold it so that it's reading from the sky. I found that this one made by Astrahori is really pretty accurate. There are several other brands on the market and I've heard good things about all of them. None of them are very expensive, at least when compared to a full-blown handheld meter, and they're quite small, so they can fit in your kit pretty easily. And since they read reflected light, we're going to say that these use subjective measurement.
All right, so now I've got the clip-on meter in the accessory shoe on the grip because the Bronica doesn't have an accessory shoe built in. The meter is reading reflected light, so this is a subjective measurement. The incident meter said 1/250th of a second at f8. Let's see what this says. This says 1/250th of a second at 4.5, so a difference. But we're going to go with it. That was a 1.5 stops more exposure than we just gave it with the incident meter.
That result was tons better than the incident meter exposure, even on such a contrasty scene. That is a pretty handy gadget. Another popular method of metering is using a spot meter. Spot meters measure reflected light, but measuring only a very small angle, usually 1 or 2 degrees. The benefit of this is that you can measure a lot of different areas of your subject to help you arrive at an ideal exposure. What does that mean? How do you do it? Well, we're going to cover a couple of different ways of how to do that. The first method is using the spot meter to average the highlight and shadow areas to give an exposure that's in the middle. The idea being that if you set the exposure halfway between the highlight and the shadow areas, it'll ensure that those areas will fall into their correct places in relation to each other. If you're new to spot metering, this is a good way to start because it requires you to start looking at your subject and identifying certain tones within it. In this case, we'll need to identify the brightest area as well as the darkest area. And those two things should be pretty easy to find.
Use the spot meter here. We're going to take an average of a highlight point and a shadow point. So I have to identify what's the highlight point and what's the shadow point. Well, I think the highlight point is easy enough to identify because it's either going to be this gravel in the front or the roof. Probably the roof, because that is really, really bright. And what's my darkest point going to be? Well, you know, at first I'm thinking, well, maybe just inside the bridge there where we're going into shadow, but we still have some great detail. I don't know that that's the darkest point, maybe somewhere underneath the bridge or in the shadow area of the trees over here. I may have to check each one of those just to see which one it is. All right, so let's play around with that for just a second. All right, so the roof, let's see, I've got 1/250th of a second. All right, so the roof at 1/250th of a second is giving me f16.5. The gravel in the front is giving me f16, so the roof is a little bit brighter. All right, so let's see what's my shadow area. Let's check right inside the bridge there. All right, in the darkest point that I can see, we've got f1. It's gonna be pretty dark. Right here in the front there, we have f2. That is a huge contrast range, and I don't know that it's something that we can do. All right, so there's my highlight point, set that into memory. My shadow point, set that into memory and average, and it looks like we have 1/125th of a second at 5.6.5. So halfway between 5.6 and f8. 1/125th of a second, 5.6.5. All right, let's shoot it. All right, so we've got some clouds here. Let's do another reading real quick. So for the roof, I now have f11, gravel is f8, f11 for the highlight, shadow. So I can go f4.5 at 1/60th of a second. Let's try that.
The spot meter I'm using is a Minolta Spot Meter F, and it has a built-in function specifically for this highlight and shadow averaging. But this really isn't that complex. We're only measuring 2 areas and computing the average. And in this case, you can just think of it more in terms of the result being the median instead of the average, because we're only measuring 2 values. And if you know your f-stops and your shutter speeds by memory, you can really just do this in your head. In this case, we had a reading of f19 for the highlights and f2 for the shadow. That's an overall dynamic range of 6.5 stops. And the f-stop in the middle of that, more or less, is f6.7. And let me go ahead and try to clear up any confusion about the in-between stop values as they appear on my older meters. Back then, they didn't include the actual values. So when I say something is measured at f16.5, that's really f19. And something like f5.6 is really 6.7. So even though I might report the value as at half, I'm going to show you the real value too. If I were a smart man, I'd just do that on the fly and say the correct value. But using a spot meter in a more advanced method than that is going to require us to learn a little bit about something called the zone system. It's a technique created by Ansel Adams and Fred Archer way back about 1940 that gives us a way to precisely define the tonal range of a photo. Now, in the strictest sense, the zone system also includes the methods of film development and making the final darkroom print. But we can certainly take advantage of at least part of the system even if we don't intend to do the developing and printing portion of it. It's a great way of learning to see or pre-visualize all the different tones in a photo. So let's take a moment and explore it just a bit. The zone system divides the entire range of tones from solid black to solid white into distinct zones. And some zone scales show 10 zones, some show 11. But in either case, zone 0 is solid black with no texture or detail. And the highest zone, whether it be zone 9 or zone 10, is solid white with no texture or detail. But on both versions of the scale, zone 5 is midway between both of them. And zone 5 is important because that's the zone of gray that light meters are calibrated to. It's that middle gray. So when you meter a portion of your scene, the exposure result you'll get is going to give you that middle gray tone. Another thing to note that when using the zone system for metering purposes, we can jump between the zones by changing the exposure by one stop. In other words, zone 6 is one stop lighter than zone 5, and zone 7 is one stop lighter than zone 6. Zone 4 is one stop darker than zone 5, and so on. The important concepts are: the meter always returns an exposure that will render whatever it is that you were measuring as zone 5, that middle gray. And 2, we can shift it to a different zone by increasing or decreasing the exposure. We just need to be able to visualize what parts of our scene need to be in which zone. What I really need is some sort of reference that I can apply to any scene. So I present to you Zone 3. Zone 3 is special in negative film because it represents shadow areas where texture and detail are still visible. And that's something that can be identified in most scenes. We just need to train ourselves to pick it out. So the first thing we'll do is set up the shot and compose it like we want. Then we're going to take a look at what's in the composition and decide on which shadow area we want to assign to Zone 3. And I'm going to use the spot meter to check a lot of different spots in the scene just to get an idea of where all those values lie. It really helps if you're able to think of these things in black and white, even if you're shooting color, because color can fool us a lot of times. So it's always worth checking values all through the shot, just so you can definitively say, this is the area I want in Zone 3. Now when you find that area, check it with a spot meter, and just remember that the meter is going to give you the result for Zone 5.
So now we're going to measure with the spot meter again, keeping the zone system in mind. So we just talked about assigning a value or assigning some part of the shot to Zone 3. I'm thinking about right inside the bridge in this second section. I see detail there. It's dark, but I see detail. I want that's what I want in Zone 3. So I'm going to spot it, and then I'm going to assign that value to Zone 3 instead of Zone 5. All right, here we come back with the sun. All right, we just checked the same spot when we were doing the shadow and highlight. So at 1/60th of a second, I get f2.8. All right, so that's Zone 5. How do we assign that now to Zone 3? We're going to underexpose it 2 stops. So instead of 2.8, we're gonna go 5.6. Let's check that again because we just had some light change. Yeah, it's the same inside though. All right, so instead of 2.8, we're gonna shoot it at 5.6 because that's gonna assign that value that we just shot, not to Zone 5, but to Zone 3, which is very close to what we just shot, averaging the highlight and shadow. So it's all sort of working together like it should. It doesn't hurt to look around other angles of the subject just to see if it's something that you can capture in a way that's not so contrasty. So the two things that were giving us trouble in that last shot was the roof, way brighter than the rest of it, and this gravel out front, which is way brighter than the rest of the shot. So now we're backlit, but from where I am, I can't see the roof. I'm close enough. I've changed angles a little bit. I do still see some of the gravel, but what I want to do instead, I want to shoot from a lower angle so that we don't see as much of that. And that way, hopefully I can get a decent shot of this and have something to go home with. I'm looking for the shadow area that I want to be dark, but still have some detail. So I think that is gonna be this area right inside the doorway of the bridge, this first little section. That's a 1/60th of a second at f2.8 and a half. All right, so if I want to assign that to zone 3, I need to move my exposure from 2.8 and a half to 4.5 and a half to 5.6 and a half. That will then make that zone 3 and not zone 5. Had to shade the lens with my cap. Shooting low in a backlit situation could give you some flare.
Now, why am I more concerned with assigning zone 3 instead of, say, zone 7? Couldn't we come up with some system for that just as easily? Well, probably so. But since I'm shooting negative film, I'm more concerned with capturing good shadow detail. And it's because underexposure is the absolute enemy of negative film. The less light that it captures, the weaker the negative is. If you look at this section of film, you see it's totally clear. No light has struck this whatsoever. There is no image at all to work with. And while we don't really want negatives that are too dense, when it comes to negative film, it's better to have too much than not enough. Now, if we were shooting color reversal or slide film, the opposite is true. But back to metering. Using the zone system in this way makes this a very subjective metering technique because you're actually choosing where all those values fall. You aren't relying on absolutes here. The brightness of the area you decide to place in zone 3 in this shot may very well be brighter or darker than an area you choose for zone 3 in a different shot. This method helps you tailor the exposure so that only the tonal values of the actual subject are important, regardless of the objective light levels. The more you familiarize yourself with the zones, the easier it'll become. I'm by no means an expert on the zone system, but it does help me visualize all the different tonal values in the shot. What we just did was exposing for the shadows, zone 3. But it's quite possible that you might occasionally find that even though you're confident that you've assigned zone 3 correctly, there could be some really, really bright tones in the rest of the shot, like the roof of that covered bridge. And maybe you've checked them with the spot meter and found that if you stick with your choice for zone 3, that'll mean that some areas that are compositionally important might fall up in the zone 8 or 9 range, or possibly off the zone scale altogether. What you'd have then is a very contrasty scene. And you can actually reduce the overall contrast, bringing the highlights back down into useful zones by reducing development time of the film. That's probably what could have been done to improve that first shot of the bridge that was so overexposed. So in the strictest sense, the next step of the zone system is development. This is much more effective in traditional black and white processes where altering the development times do affect contrast in the negatives. It's also much more effective when you can develop each shot individually to control contrast. That's why the zone system is quite popular for users of cameras such as this. Large format. With large format, you can develop each piece of film separately to control the contrast for that one photo. But for non-large format shooters, unless all the shots on the roll are the exact same tonal range, modifying development time isn't going to be beneficial. But just to see what that shot could have looked like with some post-processing, I did some adjustments. Now that's more like it, and I think the shadow detail inside the bridge is excellent and about what I intended. So when you factor in some editing, it's not a bad shot at all. Now, we've been talking a lot about spot meters in the handheld meter sense, but a lot of cameras, especially modern ones, also have built-in spot metering function. The measurement spot in a camera will usually be a lot larger in size than the 1 or 2 degrees you'll get with a dedicated meter, but it can still be used the same way. Just remember that the result of that measurement is going to give you zone 5, then you can adjust accordingly. A few cameras, though, have a really powerful spot metering function called multi-spot metering. In the last episode about the Minolta I-Series cameras, I covered how using one of their expansion cards could turn this feature on in those cameras. But there are a few cameras that incorporated this natively: the Olympus OM3 and OM4, the Canon T90, EOS 3, and their last flagship film camera, the EOS 1V. The way this works is that it's similar to measuring the highlight value and the shadow value and finding the midpoint. But in this case, it allows you to measure up to 8 different spots, which it will average to give you a correct exposure. This is a true averaging method, not just finding the median or the midpoint. Because if, for example, you decide that one area should carry more computational weight than another, you can measure it more than once. I find this type of metering extremely useful in scenes where there's contrasty lighting, and in my experience, it's an almost bulletproof method for metering.
Got the Minolta 8000i out here, and I have the Creative expansion card in here for multi-spot metering. So that's going to allow me to take spot meter readings of a bunch of different areas. It's going to compute an average of all of that. I can pick up to 8 spots, which is really cool. So same shot, let's see what we've got. I also have 100 speed film in the Minolta, so it should be, and it's the same kind of film as in the Bronica, so should be interesting to see the comparisons. All right, so let's take a spot reading on the side over here. Let's take a spot reading in the bridge there. Let's take a spot reading on the gravel here, on the grass, on the trees there in the back, and say a 2/50th of a second at f4. Let's O with 1/25th of a second at 5.6. All right, I'm coming over to the shadow side of this bridge. Well, it's the shadow side, but we still have areas that are in direct sun. So I'm gonna do a multi-spot metering over on this side just to see what we get. Yeah, this is contrasty, so let's try it out. All right, so I'm gonna do a spot right over here on the side of the bridge. I'm gonna do a spot inside. I'm gonna do a spot right here in the front. Up at the top. The trees in the background. And finally, a spot down here on the gravel. It's telling me 1/125th of a second at 5.6. Which is the same shot we had earlier.
So, seems like we covered a lot of ground today. So let's do a quick recap of today's results. The Sunny 16 is a good basic rule, but it tended to underexpose the shot. Not a whole stop, but maybe 2/3 of a stop. So I think I'd always bracket the exposure a bit when I'm using this method. I also think that using the gray card at the church gave us a better result than the Sunny 16 rule did. The incident meter performed well in more evenly lit situation. The dynamic range of the contrasty scene at the bridge, though, was just too much. Using the spot meter, identifying highlights and shadows, and finding the midpoint between the two also worked really well. But I'll also say this, that exposure matched the result we got from this little clip-on meter, which is something I wouldn't expect, but it does a really good job. Using the spot meter to find the shadow value and to reassign that value to zone 3 resulted in overexposure on the first example of that. The roof was blown out and most of the tones were in the upper mid areas. This would be one of those cases where it would be beneficial to adjust the film development time to reduce that overall contrast. And hopefully that would bring the value of the roof level down. But I was able to tweak the shot a bit in Photoshop to reduce the contrast range, and that really made the photo what more or less envisioned. As for multi-spot metering with the camera, it turned out pretty well. Being able to meter 8 separate points of the scene, then averaging them together is an excellent method of metering. One other method I need to mention is using a smartphone app. There are quite a few of them out there, and most of them measure a rather small angle, so they sort of act like a spot meter. One that I've used for years is Pocket Light Meter. It's simple. But one I just found while researching this episode is called LightMe. I like it because it displays all the shutter speeds and f-stops on a sliding scale, and therefore it's going to show you all the correct combinations at one glance. What's even cooler is that it has a function specifically for the zone system. You can take a measurement, then tap on the zone scale to tell it which zone you want that in, and it does the figuring for you, and that's really cool. Unfortunately, I think both of these apps are for iOS only. So for Android users, PhotoFriend looks like a good choice, as it also has the sliding scale for shutter and f-stop and lets you see all the combinations at the same time. So while not exhaustive of all metering methods, it was a lot to take in, especially the part about the zone system. If that didn't make total sense to you, check out that section again, and if you want even more detailed information about it, a couple of books I'd recommend are The Practical Zone System by Chris Johnson and The Confused Photographer's Guide to Photographic Exposure and the Simplified Zone System by Baman Farzad. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a like and consider subscribing to the channel. Here we have all manners of video regarding cameras and photography with a special emphasis on film. I've got a lot of good stuff in the works, so you don't want to miss it. And as always, I love to read and respond to all your comments, so feel free to let me know what you think about some of these metering techniques. Which ones do you use? Got any favorite apps that are Android compatible? Let us know. And remember, you miss all the shots you don't take, so get out there and create. See you next time.